When I say boundary, what is the first word you think of? If that B word gives you funny feelings in your tummy, especially when you think about interpersonal boundaries, then this episode is for you. Today, we begin the process of reprogramming our miseducation about boundaries.
Do you ever feel like you're spending so much time at the office that you have no time left for camp? With UltraCamp, you can track attendance, manage staff applications, and streamline registration so you'll be back outside in no time. Find out more at ultracampmanagement.com/campcode.
Welcome to Camp Code, a podcast brought to you by Go Camp Pro. We have created and are dedicated to this podcast because we believe that staff training is one of, if not the most important part of your job as a camp professional. Staff training is what prepares your staff to care for their campers, to feel confident in their skills, to do their jobs to the best of their ability, and to learn along the way. A well thought out and intentional staff training will help you in more ways than you can imagine, and we need to help each other bring our very best. Welcome to our episode all about boundaries. This is such an important topic and a big one, so we've decided to do it in two parts. But before we get started, let's just take a moment to introduce ourselves. Ruby, I'll ask you to go first, please.
Hey everyone, I'm Ruby Compton. My pronouns are she, her, and I am the Chief Exploration Officer of Ruby Outdoors, which is a company that focuses on supporting camps and outdoor programs. I'm based in Western North Carolina, but work with camps all over the world.
Great, thanks, Ruby. And Gabrielle.
My name is Gabrielle Rail. My pronouns are she, her, and I work at a wonderful camp called Camp Waro, which is an all girls camp in the Laurentian Mountains of Quebec, Canada. And we focus on creating a positive environment for gender minorities.
Thanks, Gab. And I'm Beth Allison. I'm co-owner of Camp Hacker and Go Camp Pro, and my pronouns are also she, her. As a camp consultant and trainer, my passion is building solid and supportive community and doing that through purposeful and intentional leadership training. All right, let's dive in. How do you understand boundaries? Because I think there's been a shift in cultural thought about boundaries over the last decade, and we may just need to retrain ourselves as camp pros on how we understand them and then, of course, how we implement them. So, what does that word mean to you? Ruby, let's start with you. What does boundaries mean for you?
So I'm going to share first and foremost that my exploration of boundaries really began. I became much more of a student of boundaries about, I guess, 3 years ago now, 2 years ago now, after going through a really terrible breakup and being like, I don't want to, like, I'm so sad. And ended up listening to a handful of podcasts and um, hearing this phrase was one that just like totally blew my mind, was the idea of thinking about boundaries as doors, not walls. And so often when we think about boundaries, we think about these like firm, like, nope, you can't do that. I don't want that thing, and they're very scary. It's scary and like labor intensive to think about building brick walls, which is, I think, how a lot of people picture boundaries in their brain. And this idea of a boundary really being about, no, it's like you knock on my door and I open the door and I invite you into my house. And I tell you that, let me take your coat and put it here. And I have water and lemonade and Sprite. Would you like something to drink? And the bathroom is over there. And yes, we take our shoes off before you enter the house. Like, that's actually boundary setting. And the other thing I heard on this podcast down the road was the idea that boundaries are sexy. Like, we don't think about them as being a sexy concept, but that I had put myself in many different relationships, not just interpersonal and romantic, but also work relationships, where the idea of boundaries, I was just a mesh bag of boundaries. I didn't have boundaries whatsoever around my time, around the work that I would or wouldn't do, and just like my time. Let's go back to that. It was a lot about what was on my to-do list and managing that. And that when we put ourselves in that situation, we tend to find ourselves working with other folks who also have very similar feelings and thoughts and attitudes about boundaries. So I found myself in a work relationship that is a boss employee relationship where the boss had really terrible boundaries and I had really terrible boundaries, and it was a really bad situation, in being overloaded and stressed, and my mental health was at its lowest point that I've probably ever been at. Um, and yeah, and it's like at the time I had no idea, and it wasn't until reflecting back going like, oh, yeah, boundaries are sexy. Like, if somebody else sets boundaries, I want to get to know them and I want to spend time with them. So those are the first two things I want you to try to reprogram. Is that boundaries are doors, not walls, and that boundaries are sexy. Those are two ideas to contemplate.
Excellent start. Thanks, Ruby. Okay, Gabz, what about you? What do boundaries mean to you?
Boundaries originally meant to me a knot in my stomach and my heart pounding. It meant to me people telling me I should be setting up boundaries, and I just did not know how to do that. And I felt like I was in an impossible situation. And it has evolved since then, happily, but those feelings still exist. I was listening to a podcast with Brene Brown, and we'll share some of these podcasts in the show notes. And she was referring back to somebody named Angela Duckworth, and they were talking about grit versus grind, and that we want in our lives to build that character of grit. And we want our kids to have grit, perseverance, trying. But we want to lessen the grind. And the podcaster had asked Brene to go into more depths of this, and it was just formulated so well. And for me, what she was saying, what spoke to me, was that grind is something that you do for other people, and in fear of what they think of you, and in hopes that you're going to, please them, or that they're not going to be upset with you. Whereas grit is something that you do that's difficult, but that's for yourself. And so it's really external validation versus internal validation. And I think that, for me, boundaries, I'm trying to connect more and more with what is that internal tough work that I'm trying to do, that of course is external. But I do know that I'm still very much influenced by what people think and what I think people expect from me. And so much more times than not, other people don't have such a high expectation of me as I think that they do of myself. And I know this is work that I need to work on, one, just for my own happiness, but two, because I really want my staff and my campers to learn how to have not just a healthy relationship with boundaries, but a happy, welcoming, sexy relationship with boundaries. I want them to be able to feel good and confident when they're trying to connect with themselves, and when they're trying to not only speak up and put a limit, but also be able to say yes to things. And I think boundaries allow us more opportunities to say yes to things. So something I think I'm so happy we're talking about today.
Gabz, can I add to that real quick? That
Sure.
What you just shared made me think of this thing that happened. I took my wilderness first responder research this past weekend, and it's a 3-day course. And as so often happens in those classes, like, you sit the first day, and then the question is, on the second day, are you going to sit in the same spot? Or are you going to be the chaos coordinator who sits in somebody else's spot and gives them the, like, oh, do I sit somewhere else?
Totally.
And so it's funny, I kind of ended up in a conversation with a couple folks about this, and a lot of the people in this class were camp people, because I'm in an area with a lot of camps. And I said, here's something I wonder, because this other person said, I wonder what people are going to think, especially the person next to me who I sat by the first day. I'm worried about what they're going to think if I move. Are they going to think I caused, that they caused me to move? And I was like, I wonder if some of us are more susceptible to being concerned about hurting other people's feelings than like the actual motivation of the moment, which is just like, I want to cause some chaos, or I'm going to sit over there, or I just want a different view of the classroom.
Absolutely.
I'm just cold by the window, and I'd like to move where I'm not cold. Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. I love that we're naming this concept in this day and age. In my youth, we didn't talk about personal boundaries. As a girl growing up in the 60s and 70s, mentioning how a grown up made us feel uncomfortable or being in a position that didn't sit right in our bellies was just not something that we discussed. We were expected to behave and to be polite and compliant. Grown ups were always right, and we were to do as we were told. Like, hugging a relative that we didn't really want to, or smiling politely when somebody made a comment on our physical appearance. I am so grateful that, like many things in this century, we're putting a label on them and encouraging thoughtful discussions so that everybody can work to feel safe and comfortable in healthy ways. For me, I found the definition that I like from outofthefog.net that says that boundaries are guidelines, rules, or limits that a person creates to identify, and this is the key piece for me, for themselves, what are reasonable, safe, and permissible ways for other people to behave around them, and how they will respond if somebody steps outside those limits. Now, as important as boundaries are, and as much as I am a strong proponent, why do I find it a struggle sometimes? Why is it something that doesn't come so easily for me and likely maybe for some of you? And we've touched on a couple of these already, but I think there's a fear of rejection. So I worry that I might anger or disappoint somebody or lose them as a friend or a colleague. There is fear of confrontation, and a lot of us struggle with that. I am not a fan. Um, and I have to work on that. And I think for me, the biggest one is guilt. And I have no idea where that comes from, other than, as I said, we were not all raised with healthy boundaries. And of course, there is a huge spectrum of unhealthy there. But I do think many of us were raised to be people pleasers. And I often find myself feeling responsible for other people's happiness. And that tends to butt up against creating healthy boundaries. And for me, and probably many like me, setting personal boundaries can sometimes kind of feel awkward or uncomfortable at first. So I have to keep reminding myself why this is important and why I should do it. So, my brain is constantly saying you have to practice self care and self respect. You need to communicate your needs in a relationship. You need to make time and space for positive interactions, which is the goal, right? And the one I think I personally need to be constantly working on is the ideas that boundaries can help me to be assertive, to confidently and truthfully say yes or no, and also to be okay when others say no to me. So, in the end, for me, boundaries help empower myself to make healthy choices and take responsibility for myself. So, it is worth the work. Um, Setting boundaries is essential. And I know that in my brain, if I want to be physically and emotionally healthy, and I need to remember that creating healthy boundaries is empowering. By recognizing that need to set and enforce limits, I'm protecting my self esteem, I'm maintaining self respect, and I'm enjoying healthy relationships. But all that being said, it's much simpler to say than do. For me, there's effort involved. Setting and sustaining boundaries is a skill. And like any skill, I think we just need to practice to get good at it. Now, before we jump into ways that we can set better boundaries in our own lives, we have a few words for you from our amazing sponsor.
We wouldn't be here today podcasting for you without the support from our sponsor, UltraCamp. Have you heard that UltraCamp is offering a free guide titled 5 Unique Ways to Connect with Campers Outside of Camp? And when you visit ultracampmanagement.com/camp code, you can download this free guide and find out more about UltraCamp's powerful tools that put you in control of your information. Those tools include automating your billing, creating custom reports, managing your hiring process, including integrated background checks, communicating with customers and donors, and adding in the efficiency of automation. And you have a platform that you can put to work for you. UltraCamp's goal is to provide resources so their clients can spend more time in camp doing what they do best. If all of this doesn't sound like your registration software, don't you think it should? Visit their website, ultracampmanagement.com/camp code, and set up a time to chat. They look forward to meeting you.
And we're back. So, Ruby, let's start with you. How can we set boundaries in our lives? What's worked for you?
Yeah. So the first thing I would encourage you to do is to think back on a time when you knew somebody had crossed a boundary. And I think so often that is, we probably had some really visceral response to it, like, oh, don't go there, don't touch me there, don't do this thing, right? Or that really upset me or offended me. And I actually want to tie that to something I've heard from many camp directors. And I think, Beth, I'm so appreciative of what you shared before our ad break about some of the conflict I think we're seeing in generational differences is this idea that you have a lot of folks who are in charge of younger adults today who were raised in a place where you didn't speak into this discomfort. If something was uncomfortable, you just kind of dealt with it, and the silence was how you dealt with it. It was impolite. It was rude, in fact,
Right.
to say like, "Oh, I'll hug this person," right? And so now you're hearing from camp directors, they're going, "It doesn't matter what I say. I feel like I'm hurting someone's feelings." And so to directly tie that to our conversation today is I want to encourage you that when you find yourself muttering that phrase or saying that phrase to yourself, to step back and go, nope, what just happened is you found somebody's boundary. And so we need to find a way to take it from being this like kind of, I cannot think of the word right now, amorphous, like, not concrete feeling into something that we can describe. And I have heard boundaries be referred to as describing a container. So like if I hold this cup up, if you're watching us on YouTube, like you could probably come up with describing words to tell me about this container. And like it's hard and it's insulated and it has a top and there's a hole and there's a metal straw, and right, but I can like describe it, hold it. And that's a way more comfortable place for us to be when we can specifically describe stuff than it is when it's just like this feeling that doesn't really have a name. And so what I want to encourage you to do is when you find yourself having that funny feeling in your tummy, whether it's you've crossed someone else's boundary and they are speaking to you saying, hey, you crossed a boundary, or you are finding yourself in the like, wow, I think I have a boundary there that I didn't even know. So take a step back and see if you can describe it. And you can use words just like you would use to describe anything that holds something, any sort of container. So a boundary is not a brick wall. A boundary can be a mesh bag. It can be very flexible. It can have some holes in it. It could be silicone, right, where it bends and flexes and takes the shape of what it's around. They can be very firm and hard. It can be a small boundary and it can be a big boundary. It can be one that this is the boundary you need for right now, but it's not the forever boundary. So I want you to think about that. And if you think about a time when you were like, oh, I'm feeling, some people might describe it as triggered. Some people just might describe it as like unsettled. Think about a time when that happened and see if you can step back and describe that boundary and put some container-like words to that experience.
Excellent. Thanks, Ruby. How about you, Gab? What works for you?
I think for me, one of the first steps that I took with asserting boundaries was celebrating when I heard other people assert boundaries. Because when I would do that, I would try to connect with actually, am I really proud of them for doing that? And so I go quickly to my staff members who would, maybe there was bigger boundaries, but there would be just like little ones, like I'm not really comfortable doing that. And I have some internally a knee-jerk reaction of, well, I've made sure it's safe. Like, what do you mean you're not comfortable? Like I do have an internal knee-jerk reaction.
Especially as a camp director, I think.
Sure. And then she's like, do you know what energy I put into it's fine.
That's right.
You're going to be fine. Just do it. But just really pausing and saying, oh, thank you for letting me know, validating them. And of course, just by doing that, it's me also speaking to myself. I needed to get to a place where I was validating my feelings, my experiences, what I needed. And much like you, Beth, guilt is really strong inside of me, and feeling selfish is really, really high as well. And I know that's not the case. But I also do like making people happy, and I do like supporting individuals. But I had to put myself in a mind frame that this is positive and that they would be happy for me, that I'm taking care of myself. So I started with celebrating when people are asserting certain boundaries or just simple asks, being grateful for what they're doing, and also maybe acknowledging that was tough for them, especially if there was a power dynamic. If it was a staff member telling me or a camper that was telling me, I would acknowledge that it might be difficult to tell me this, and I really appreciate it. And I remember saying that to one of my staff members and saying, I'm sure it wasn't easy telling me, what you're asking for. And they were like, no, it wasn't hard at all. Why? And I was like, you are years ahead of me.
That's great.
Why no, that wasn't hard. Great, good. Just me. I just need to keep working on it. So that's where I started.
That's great. Thanks, Gab. When I think about setting boundaries, especially for camp people, I think about two amazing staff members that I had years ago. And one was a young woman. We hired her when she was first 17, and she was with us for many years after that. And she was, and still is, bouncy and full of so much energy. And she's very extroverted, and campers loved her. But even at her young age, and I would say this probably began when she was about 19, which was, 20 years ago, and she was on senior staff, she would occasionally arrive at the breakfast table, sit down after grace, and announce to everyone sitting around her, "This is a no touch day." And this was her way of saying, I need space.
Yeah.
It's not a day for hugs or pats on the back or folks getting, too close to me. It's a no touch day. And it worked brilliantly. I mean, that's all she had to say. And in fact, it took on traction. And I would hear other staff members using that phrase occasionally. And it was simple and brilliant. And the other was a staff member who, after she had graduated from divinity school and got her very first congregation, she completely burnt out in about 6 months, trying to do everything and be everything to everyone in her congregation. And it happened to be the little old church ladies who taught her that she needed to set boundaries so she could continue her vocation. So they encouraged her to block off her days into 3 sections: morning, afternoon, and evening, and to only allow herself to work on the actual day she was supposed to be working 2 out of those 3 blocks. And they encouraged her very strongly to let her parishioners know this and explaining her boundaries and why, even announcing it at the pulpit on a Sunday, and to ask them to help her keep that particular boundary. And it saved her career and her mental health. So I always think of those two staff members. How then do we go about setting personal boundaries? So for me, as you will well know if you've heard podcasts before, I like to make lists. So I would take the time to journal, or I mean, you can think about it, or while you're out walking or hiking, or you can draw if you want. But the types of boundaries that I need to set in my life, and categories can sometimes help us define them. And if you Google like what are personal boundaries, you're going to get a bunch of different answers, but they're all very relatively similar. But the ones that I like best come from the holistic psychologist. And so she uses 5 boundaries. So one's emotional, so inappropriate questions or topics or emotional dumping. The second is material, uh, possessions, like what can be shared, how they should be treated. The third is time and energy. So plans, lateness, no-shows, favors, free labor, all those kinds of things fit under there. Mental, of course, our thoughts and our values, our opinions and beliefs. And physical, so the proximity, touch, PDA, unwanted sexual or physical comments. So those are emotional, material, time, energy, mental, and physical. And as Ruby said, this is fluid. Things change, new situations arise. And you certainly, if you don't feel you have a lot of boundaries, have to sit down now and figure all of them out at once. But I found for me, it was a really good framework to kind of help figure it out. So if I know what I want them to be, or at least, a few of them as I work on my list, how do I let other people know what my boundaries are? So positivepsychology.com has these 4 steps, which I'm sure are also very common among other people as well. But the first one is to define. So identify that desired boundary. Number 2 is to communicate. So you say what you need. Number 3 is to stay simple and don't over explain it, which is where I always wind up in trouble. And then number 4 is to set consequences. So say why it's important to you. And like anything that we've talked about over the years in Camp Code, we always encourage people to use I statements when you're communicating. So things like, I feel this when this happens because of this. What I need is this. And when I'm really, really struggling to set limits and boundaries, it always helps me to remember that I have rights. I have a right to say no without feeling guilty. I have a right to be treated with respect. I have a right to make my needs as important as others, a right to be accepting of my own mistakes, my own failures, and a right not to meet other people's unreasonable expectations of me. And let me tell you, just stating these only once does not mean I have that. I have to keep repeating these kinds of things to myself. I have to keep reminding myself that boundaries are important for both individuals in a relationship and for the health of that relationship too. Without them, I think I can sometimes feel resentful or taken advantage of, and eventually I may shut down and withdraw. And it can affect my sense of self-esteem, my self-worth, and my overall personal comfort level. But clear boundaries are what allow us to remain connected, and communicating these boundaries shows a respect for the relationship, because it says that we're willing to put the work in to ensure that it stays strong and safe. So setting boundaries takes practice and determination, but for me, I have to keep reminding myself that I just can't let my anxiety or fear or guilt prevent me from taking care of myself. When I feel anger and or resentment, or find myself whining or complaining, it probably means I need to set a boundary. So learning to set healthy boundaries, as I said before, takes time and it's a process.
Beth,
Anybody else have anything else to say? Ruby,
I
yeah,
just want to highlight the statement that you just made that's like so genius and is a bit like counterintuitive, which is clear boundaries are what make us feel connected. And I think very few people think about boundaries as a connection point.
Yes.
And instead we think about them as blockers, but they are trust builders 100%, and they are bridges. And that is like one of the biggest miseducations of boundaries, I think, that there are. Even firm boundaries, that there are times when people have to cut people, activities, things out of their lives. And even those are connection points, even if not in that moment. So I just like ponder on that a little bit, because it's stinking brilliant.
And it is stinking brilliant. And it's, you can inception yourself, and in the sense of like where we talk about how do we teach, let's just say, staff members self-care. And we could talk about self-care, but one of the ways, at Camp Code that we find is helpful to teach staff members something like self-care is asking staff, how do we help foster an environment for campers to feel comfortable with self-care? And in doing so, our staff members tend to be able to do that for themselves in an easier way. And I think when it comes to boundaries, a lot of camp directors will put themselves last on so many things, including days off. I'm talking to you, whoever's listening, you know who you are. There's a bunch of camp directors out there that don't take time off or days off. They're the first one awake, the last one to bed. And I understand it because I have that tendency too. But we need to teach our staff members, we have to practice this so that they're not doing the same thing, not just in their professional lives, but in their personal lives. And I also want to say that, Ruby and I have been talking about boundaries quite a bit, and I would call her and say, I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to put a line down here. I'm not quite sure how to say certain things. This is a internal lifelong learning that we have the opportunity to do. And it is uncomfortable and it's difficult, but it's possible. So try not to be too hard on yourself if you're having difficulties with a board member or your board in particular, or some, maybe your executive director, or even family, parents, for your organization. this is something that you're learning, and that might be a really big step, is to face your board. That might be a big step. What are some of the smaller steps that you can do to start to build that confidence? Who can you call? And it's going to feel also, I feel it feels counterintuitive sometimes to set boundaries. It feels the opposite of what I should be doing. And in my previous camp professional days, I was a kayak instructor. And anybody that does whitewater kayaking knows that for you to do a proper hip flick or a proper roll to right yourself up on a kayak, your head is the last part of your body to come out of the water. And that is against our muscle memory. It is survival to have your head come out of the water first. When you jump in the lake, or ocean or river, you want to breathe first. But if you want to right your kayak, it's your hips, and then it's a vertebrae per vertebrae wave, and the last part is your head. And and no matter, you can tell that to every single person you try to teach, no matter what, Ruby's laughing because she also teaches whitewater awesomeness. No matter what, your body, your muscle memories is going to yank that head up. Your head is going to strain up. And it's only over breathing and practicing and doing bit by bit and trying that it starts to feel more and more natural to do so. So it's a hard thing to do. And I think in the camping industry, it's very difficult because we're in the business of caring, and sometimes boundaries feels like we're not caring. And that's not the case, but it can feel awkward.
And I think the final thing I would say is that setting boundaries, and it kind of sort of goes along with what Gabz was saying, it's not always comfortable, and people may push back if you say no to some things or try communicating your needs more clearly. People may test your limits to see how serious you are about drawing that line, or they may be used to you responding in a certain way, like agreeing to take on everything, and they may push back when you try to make those changes. But it doesn't mean that you're doing something wrong. It may just mean that you need to be clear and consistent until people adjust to this new way of interacting. So as Ruby said, we can really think of setting boundaries as fortifying relationships with others rather than building those walls to keep people out. All right. Anything else before we head to Gabrielle? All right, Gabz, let's have that recap, please.
It is that time. I love the recap. All right. Here we go. A recap. This is a great one. And I want to just say personally, I appreciate Beth and Ruby, you being vulnerable today with sharing about our boundaries, because this is something that's difficult, and it is a personal journey that we can learn and do together. And one of those things is, first and foremost, is understanding your own relationship and awkwardness when it comes to boundaries, acknowledging it, breathing through and saying it's okay. Asking yourself, what is your struggle? Where does the fear come from? And for us, it's a whole bunch of different experiences. And a lot of it can be with people not knowing how to be receptive to your boundaries. And so look at those moments and see, oh, this is perhaps why I'm having such a hard time with setting my boundaries. But we know that there is some good role modeling that we can do for our staff members. One of the mindsets that you can take is, instead of looking at boundaries as a brick wall, we can look at it as a door. It's a door to opening relationships, relationship norms. And if you're Ruby, you can also start to try describing what that boundary is. Sometimes people think it's a hard no, a hard stop, which it can be for people, but it can also be elastic, it can be transparent, it can be meshy. What does it physically look like, so that it can help you give that information and language when you're talking to the person. We also want to use I statements. This is how I'm experiencing things. This is how I feel. I invite you into the conversation, but I also need some limits. We're looking also at boundaries as a grind versus grit. What is the external validation versus your internal validation, and knowing that what other people think about you might be influencing you, and it might not be what's best for you at that time. And there's some wonderful things that you can find out at outofthefog.net, including something that's like 1 through 5, and I don't really know what that is, but you go to the website and you can find it. But Beth was also talking about one of the ways to talk about boundaries is defining it, saying what you need, make it simple, and also talk about the consequences and the needs of those boundaries. And that is the end of our recap with a small little asterisk at the end. No touch days. I love it.
I will let her know. Thanks, Gab. As we start to wrap up this episode, you can let us know your thoughts on any of our Camp Code episodes by using that hashtag Camp Code. You can tell us topics you'd like us to discuss, guests that you recommend we have on the show, and of course, any great leadership training tips that you'd like to share. We would love to hear from you because, as we say all the time, we're all about sharing in this industry. And today we have a very special request. Our 100th episode is just around the corner. In fact, it's the next one. And to celebrate, we need your help. I can't believe we've done 99 episodes already. We would love for you to let us know in the coming days what your favorite piece of advice has been from 9 seasons of podcasting. What little nugget of wisdom did you hear that you've put to great use at your camp? How did incorporating something you heard from one of our podcasts change the way you do something, whether it's big or small? We will give you a shout out on our 100th anniversary podcast. And we'll also be sharing our favorite pieces of advice that we have heard from each other over the years. So get ready to celebrate with us by letting us know your very favorite Camp Code takeaway. You can email Ruby at ruby@gocamp.pro with your best tips that you've learned from the show, and we may just highlight your submission on episode 100. And if you have found this podcast to be useful, we would love it if you could leave us a rating and a review for us in your podcasting app. Your feedback does help keep the show going. So as we wrap up today, here is how you can contact us individually. Ruby.
You can email me, ruby@rubyoutdoors.com, or you can find me at ruby@gocamp.pro. I checked both of those. You can also find me on Instagram at rubyoutdoors, and you can find me on Twitter at rubylyn85. And you can also read about my most recent Woofer course and how that went in the COVID times on Twitter.
Great. And Gabz, we're going to figure out how we can contact you before you give us your best practice.
So for me, info@waro.com, ouareau.com. You can follow me on Instagram at, what is my name? Gabrielle Rail. Rail takes 2 L's.
Perfect. You can find out all about me at gocamp.pro, or Beth@gocamp.pro is my email, or you can find me on Twitter at Topaz. So for our next episode, as we've alluded to in our last few podcasts and already today, is episode 100, looking back and looking forward. So don't forget to email Ruby today with what you've learned from our first 99 Camp Codes. Our final segment on each podcast is a best practice for leadership training, and we would love to hear some of your memorable moments and most effective tips. And you can tell us what they are using that hashtag Camp Code. And this week's best practice is from Gabrielle.
And so for me, I am somebody that forgets pretty much everything. I am a live in the moment now type person. And there's positives to that, because if we got into maybe a little bit of a awkward or frustrating moment earlier, I will not remember, and I'm over it, and I've moved on. So there's some positives about it, but there's also, of course, when staff members come and talk to me, and there's some really important information that I do need to remember, that I'm not trustworthy with that. So I think for me, my best practice is something that I've learned from a previous camp director who had said, make sure that you tell your staff members from day one your shortcomings, and also give the why that you have these shortcomings. And you might want to use different language. It can be something that you need assistance with, or that you need help with, but give also the reason behind it. So without a fail, and I've spoken about this in multiple podcasts, but I think it helps and makes sense. Tell your staff members that there's certain things that you're great with, and there's other things that you sometimes struggle and will need their assistance. And it's not a sign of you not caring, it's just something that you sometimes struggle with. And I've appreciated hearing from other camp professionals when they're leading a session that they will acknowledge that they're not great at time management and that they'll need somebody to help out. So isolating some of those things that maybe we try to hide from because we don't want to acknowledge it, but putting it out there for your staff members to know, and then empowering them on how they can support you. So now when staff members come up to me and say, I have really something really important that we need to talk about, should we go to your office? And because I'm excited because I live in the now, I'm like, tell me now. And they go, yes, I will tell you when we get to your office. And I'm like, oh, great, good call. So giving them the actionable as well. So what's maybe one of your shortcomings and how can they help you out?
Excellent. Thanks so much, Gab.
No problem.
Camp Code is part of the Go Camp Pro podcast network. You can check out all our other podcasts at gocamp.pro/podcasts. There are some amazing people with very wise advice, so look them up and give them a listen. And in fact, Ruby's going to tell us about what she's listened to most recently.
Oh, I'm so excited about this episode. I've been excited about it since they've released it, and I've been excited to talk about it. I cannot get over the bravery of episode 27 of the Camp Owners podcast because hosts Kelly and Howie, who run their own camps, invited their spouses, who are also their business partners, to come on the podcast and talk about that. You can hear them discuss the ins and outs of the blurry lines between personal and professional life, the joys, the challenges, and everything in between. So yeah, just check it out. It's so smart. For now, I'm gonna pass it back to you, Beth.
Thanks, Ruby. And for now, from all of us here at Camp Code, thanks for the listening, friends.